The flashing red and blue lights painted the falling snow in violent bursts of color, a stark, rhythmic heartbeat against the dead silence of the mountain pass. State Trooper Miller gripped his maglite, its beam cutting a shaky path through the swirling flakes, landing on the chrome skull adorning the fender of the Harley-Davidson. The bike idled with a low, guttural rumble, a beast barely restrained. Astride it sat a man who looked like he was carved from the mountain itself, broad-shouldered and encased in leather bearing the unmistakable, notorious winged death head of the Hells Angels. Behind him, a smaller figure was huddled, wrapped in his jacket, her face buried in his back. Miller's hand rested instinctively on the butt of his service weapon. This was the kind of stop that went sideways fast. He'd gotten the call, a lone motorcycle in a closed-off pass, pushing through the blizzard. Reckless at best, criminal at worst. He approached the rider's side, his boots crunching on the fresh powder. "Sir, I need you to kill the engine." The biker, whose leather cut bore the name Rook above the club patch, slowly turned his head. His face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights, a thick beard dusted with snow, and eyes that held the cold, steady calm of a predator. He didn't look scared. He looked annoyed. With a flick of his thumb, the Harley's threatening growl died, leaving only the whisper of the wind. "Problem, officer?" Rook's voice was gravel, a sound that seemed to scrape the air. Miller's light drifted past him to the woman. Her hair was matted with ice, her face pale and tear-streaked. A dark, ugly bruise was beginning to bloom across her cheekbone, a violent purple against her frozen skin. She was shivering uncontrollably, her small frame swallowed by the oversized leather jacket. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Miller asked, his tone shifting from authoritative to concerned. The woman, Clara, flinched at his voice, pressing herself tighter against Rook's back. She didn't answer. "Step off the bike, sir," Miller commanded, his suspicion returning tenfold. A biker, a terrified woman, a deserted road in a snowstorm. The math was simple and ugly. Rook swung a heavy leg over the seat, his boots landing solidly on the asphalt. He moved with a deliberate slowness that was more intimidating than any sudden motion. He stood a full head taller than the trooper, a veritable wall of leather and muscle. "She's fine," Rook rumbled. "Just cold. She doesn't look fine," Miller countered, shining the light directly in Rook's eyes. "She looks terrified. What's going on here?" Before Rook could answer, a small, choked sob escaped Clara. She looked up, her eyes pleading with the trooper. "He didn't do anything," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "He found me." Miller's gaze softened slightly, but his guard remained up. "Found you where?" "There's nothing for 20 miles in either direction." Clara's gaze dropped to the snow-covered ground. The shame and fear were a palpable weight. "He threw me out," she breathed, the confession barely audible over the wind. My husband. He threw me out of the car." The trooper's face hardened, but his focus shifted. He looked from Clara's bruised face to the empty, unforgiving wilderness around them, then back to the imposing biker who stood between them like a guardian gargoyle. The simple, ugly math he'd done in his head suddenly had a new, more horrifying solution. They say a man in colors is trouble looking for a place to happen. But sometimes trouble is just a woman freezing to death in the snow, and the only help that arrives is riding a steel horse straight from hell. An hour earlier, that steel horse had been the only sound on the desolate stretch of highway. Rook and his road brother, a burly, bearded biker named Grizz, were cutting through the storm on a solemn mission. It was the anniversary of a fallen brother's death, and their tradition was a ride to the crash site, a quiet toast of whiskey, and a silent prayer to the road gods. The clubhouse could have waited. The storm was getting worse, the snow coming down in thick, wet sheets that clung to their leathers and iced up their beards. "We should turn back, Rook," Grizz had yelled over the roar of his engine. "This ain't riding weather. It's survival weather." Rook didn't answer. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the ghost of another storm, another loss. His sister, Sarah. He saw her face in the swirling snow, her eyes wide with a fear he'd been too young and too powerless to fight. He shook his head, trying to banish the memory. That's when he saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of his headlights beam. A smudge of darkness against the suffocating white. He slowed his bike, Grizz pulling up alongside him. It was a person. A small figure standing on a shoulder, wearing what looked like a thin dress. No coat, no boots, just a ghost in the blizzard. He pulled over, the tires of his Harley crunching on the virgin snow. Clara didn't see them as saviors. She saw two massive, leather-clad figures emerging from the storm on roaring machines, their faces obscured by helmets and icy beards. Her heart seized in her chest. Dorian had thrown her out, but this felt like a new, more immediate kind of damnation. She stumbled backward, falling into a snowdrift, her bare feet screaming with a pain that was both fire and ice. She tried to scramble away, crab-walking backward, a pathetic, terrified whimper escaping her lips. Rook raised a gloved hand, a universal signal to halt. "Easy there," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. He removed his helmet, shaking the snow from his hair. He saw her properly then. The terror in her eyes, the blossoming bruise, the dress completely inadequate for a cool autumn evening, let alone a freak blizzard. It was a cocktail dress, something for a party. He saw the faint red marks on her wrists, the split in her lip. This wasn't an accident. This was a disposal. Grizz killed his engine and dismounted, his expression grim. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, pulling off his own thick riding gloves. "Rook, look at her feet." They were turning a deep, alarming shade of blue. Lucas got twisted. He saw Sarah again, cowering in the corner of her kitchen, her own abuser standing over her, his face a mask of drunken rage. The memory was a hot spur in his side, a failure that had defined the man he became. He had built a life around a code, a brotherhood that protected its own. And that code had one unbreakable rule. You don't stand by while the strong prey on the weak. Especially not when it's a man preying on a woman. He crouched down, moving slowly so as not to spook her further. "We're not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady. "We just want to help. What's your name?" She stared at him, her mind a fog of cold and fear. "Clara. Okay, Clara. We need to get you warm. Now." He shrugged out his own leather jacket, the thick hide stiff with cold. The Hell's Angels patch on the back seemed to glare into the storm. He draped it over her trembling shoulders. The warmth of his body still clung to the lining, a small pocket of life in the frozen wasteland. It was the first moment of kindness she'd felt in years, and it broke something inside her. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "He threw me out," she whispered, the same 4 words she would later repeat to the trooper. 4 words that signed a death warrant. Back on the roadside, Trooper Miller was processing the scene. He looked at Rook, really looked at him, and saw past the intimidating colors. He saw the protective stance, the way he shielded Clara from the wind, the genuine anger in his eyes, an anger not directed at the police, but the unseen monster who had left her here to die. "Your husband," Miller said to Clara, his voice gentle. "Where is he?" "Dorian," she stammered. He was angry. He was driving back to the house. She pointed vaguely back up the mountain. The estate with the big iron gates. Miller knew the place. Dorian Vance, a real estate tycoon with a fortress on the mountain, a man known for his lavish parties, political connections, and a notoriously short temper. He was considered untouchable. "I'll call it in," Miller said, reaching for his radio. "We can get you to a shelter, get a statement." "No." Clara's voice was suddenly sharp, filled with a fresh wave of panic. "No police. Please. He'll find me. He'll say I'm crazy, that I ran off. He'll finish it. You don't understand what he's like." Miller looked at Rook, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The message was clear. Pushing her would break her. The trooper was caught between protocol and humanity. He made a decision. "All right," he sighed, clicking off his radio. "I didn't see a motorcycle on a closed pass. I just saw a stalled vehicle. I stopped to assist. You get her somewhere warm. You get her safe. But if I hear anything about a rich guy on a mountain having a bad accident, I'll know who to talk to first." Rook gave a curt nod. "Fair enough." He helped Clara back onto the bike, settling her behind him and wrapping her frozen hand around his waist. He started the engine, its roar a defiant shout against the storm. As they pulled away, Trooper Miller stood in the swirling snow, watching the single red taillight disappear into the white abyss. He had a feeling he'd just witnessed the beginning of a story that wouldn't end quietly. The Hells Angels clubhouse wasn't a place you stumbled upon. It was an anonymous-looking warehouse on the industrial outskirts of town, fortified with steel doors and security cameras. To the outside world, it was nothing. To the members, it was church, home, and fortress all in one. When Rook and Grizz rolled in, the heavy bay door sliding shut behind them, the dozen or so members inside stopped what they were doing. The air, thick with the smell of stale beer, motor oil, and cigar smoke, fell silent. They saw the state of the woman Rook was carefully helping off his bike, and their expressions shifted from curiosity to a collective, simmering rage. These were hard men, lifers in a world of violence and rebellion, but their code was absolute. They took care of their own, and they punished those who hurt the defenseless. A tough-looking woman named Danny, a retired Army medic who was married to the club's sergeant-at-arms, immediately took charge. Get her inside by the fire. Somebody get blankets. And hot coffee. Now, Clara was led to a worn leather couch near a roaring fireplace. The sudden warmth was so intense, it was painful, her frozen nerves screaming back to life. Danny knelt before her, expertly examining her feet and hands. "It's bad," she said, her voice grim. "Superficial frostbite, but another hour out there, and she'd be losing toes," as Danny worked, wrapping Clara's extremities in warm blankets. The story came out in broken pieces. She spoke of Dorian Vance, not as the charismatic businessman the public saw, but as the monster behind the mansion's closed doors. He was a sadist who thrived on control, isolating her from friends and family, chipping away at her identity until she was nothing more than his possession. The abuse was meticulous, financial, emotional, and when he grew bored, brutally physical. Tonight's rage had been triggered by a burnt steak. A simple, stupid mistake that had resulted in him dragging her from the dinner table, down the long marble hallway, and out into the blizzard. "He told me to walk home," she whispered, her voice hollow as she stared into the flames. "He said if I valued my life, I'd learn to be more careful." He laughed. As he drove away, Rook stood by the bar, listening, his hands clenched in a fist so tight his knuckles were white. The parallels to his sister's story were uncanny. The wealthy, charming husband, the isolation, the escalating violence, the final, brutal act that he'd arrived too late to stop. He'd found Sarah's body in her perfect suburban home, the police already there, her husband weeping crocodile tears and spinning a story about a fall downstairs. The man had walked, his high-priced lawyers painting Sarah as unstable and clumsy. Rook had been a prospect back then, young and full of impotent rage. He'd wanted to hunt the man down, but the club had held him back, telling him it wasn't their business. It was that day he vowed that when he became president, the club's business would change. He would never again be too late. He would never again stand by. He looked at his brothers, their faces set like stone. He saw his own pain and rage reflected in their eyes. This wasn't just about Clara anymore. This was about Sarah. It was about every woman who had ever been made to feel small and afraid by a man who confused cruelty with strength. Grizz came to stand beside him, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "That bastard picked the wrong woman to throw away. Prez," he said, his voice a low growl. "He threw her right to us." Rook nodded, his decision made. He walked over to the couch and knelt in front of Clara. She flinched, her ingrained fear of men still a raw nerve. He waited patiently until she met his gaze. "Clara," he said, his voice softer than she'd thought possible. "He will never touch you again. That is my word. That is the word of every man in this room. We're going to finish this." For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear appeared in her eyes. It was a fragile, tentative spark of hope. The plan was forged in the firelight of the clubhouse, a symphony of biker ingenuity and street-level intelligence. They knew a direct assault on Dorian's fortress was foolish. He had security, cameras, and the kind of alarm system that brought private contractors with automatic weapons, not just local cops. But power like Dorian's had cracks. Rook dispatched his intelligence officer, a wiry hacker who went by the name Ghost, to start digging. Within hours, they had a blueprint of Dorian's life. His financial records, his business partners, his daily routines. And they found his weakness. Dorian wasn't just a real estate mogul. He used his massive, climate-controlled warehouses to facilitate the movement of high-end stolen art for the Russian mob. A very profitable, very illegal side hustle. A shipment was due to be moved tomorrow night, during the continued cover of the storm. That was their opening. The objective wasn't just retribution, it was annihilation. They would not only save Clara, but they would also strip Dorian of the power and wealth that enabled his cruelty. The next night, the storm still raged, a perfect cloak for their operation. A team of 10 bikes, their engines muffled as best they could be, rolled out into the darkness. They moved like a pack of wolves, silent and deadly. They didn't go to the warehouse. That was a diversion. Ghost, working from a van parked a mile away, hacked into the warehouse's security feed, looping the footage of an empty loading bay. Meanwhile, another member, a master locksmith, was already at work on the back door of Dorian's corporate office downtown. The real prize wasn't the stolen art. It was the ledger, the encrypted hard drives that detailed every illegal transaction Dorian had ever made. While the main team created a visible but non-violent disturbance at the warehouse, setting off alarms, cutting power to a section of the grid to draw Dorian out of his mansion, Rook and Grizz entered the office. They were in and out in under 7 minutes, carrying a briefcase that held Dorian Vance's entire empire. The final act was set. They sent an anonymous text to Dorian from a burner phone. "We have your package. The real one. Meet us." Alone, the location was a derelict bridge on the edge of town, a place where deals went down and bodies were sometimes found. Dorian, arrogant and enraged that mere bikers would dare to challenge him, arrived in his sleek black sedan, his 2 bodyguards in a trailing SUV. He stepped out into the biting wind, his expensive suit looking absurd in the gritty setting. Lined up on the bridge were the 10 Harleys, their headlights cutting through the darkness, pinning him in their combined glare. Rook stepped forward into the light, the briefcase in his hand. "Vance," he greeted, his voice flat and cold. "You're looking for this?" Dorian sneered. "I don't know who you think you are, but you've just made the biggest mistake of your life. My people will hunt you down like the dogs you are." Rook laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Your people? The Russians you do business with? We sent them a little preview of the files in this case. An appetizer. They're very interested in the creative accounting you've been doing with their money. I don't think they'll be on your side for much longer." The color drained from Dorian's face. His bodyguards shifted nervously, their hands inching toward their jackets. "What do you want?" Dorian hissed. "Money. We want you to listen," Rook said, taking another step forward. From behind the line of bikes, a figure emerged. It was Clara. She wasn't shivering anymore. Dressed in warm clothes, flanked by the bikers, she stood tall, her gaze steady and unafraid. She held a phone in her hand. "I've already spoken to the FBI, Dorian," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying over the wind. "I've told them everything. About the art, the money laundering, and about what you did to me. What you've done to me for years." Dorian stared at her, his mask of control finally shattering, revealing the pathetic coward beneath. He lunged, not at Rook, but at her, a last, desperate act of dominance. He never made it. In a blur of motion, Grizz stepped in his path, catching him with a single, precise punch that sent him sprawling to the wet asphalt. His bodyguards, seeing the sheer, unified force arrayed against them, wisely put their hands in the air. Rook dropped the briefcase at Dorian's feet. "It's over," he said. "You've lost everything. Your business, your freedom, your power." He crouched down, getting in Dorian's face. "You will never go near her again. You will never speak her name. You will disappear. Because if you don't, the feds will be the least of your problems. We will be the last thing you ever see. Do you understand me?" Sobbing, defeated, Dorian Vance nodded. The resolution wasn't a fiery explosion, but a quiet, satisfying dismantling. With the evidence from the hard drives and Clara's testimony, Dorian Vance's empire crumbled. He was arrested, his assets frozen, his powerful friends abandoning him like rats from a sinking ship. The Russians, true to form, made sure he knew his betrayal would not be forgotten, even in prison. Clara, with the support of Danny and the club, began to rebuild her life. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, forged in a blizzard and reborn in the fires of brotherhood. She testified against Dorian with unshakable courage, her voice ringing with the strength she had rediscovered. She stayed in town, using a portion of the victims' restitution fund she received to help establish a new, discreet shelter for women fleeing abuse, one with better security and resources than any that had existed before. She never forgot the men who saved her. She became a friend to the club, a permanent fixture at their Sunday barbecues, a godmother to their children. She was family. Months later, on a warm summer evening, Clara stood on the porch of her own small house, watching the sunset paint the sky. She heard the familiar, distant rumble of a Harley-Davidson coming down the road. It was Rook, stopping by to check in as he often did. The sound no longer held any fear for her. It was the sound of loyalty, the sound of protection. It was the sound of her angels, the ones who wore leather instead of wings, who rode steel horses through the darkest storms to deliver a justice the world had forgotten how to provide. They saved her life, but in doing so, they also saved a piece of themselves, reaffirming the code that bound them together, proving that even in the deepest, coldest darkness, the roar of a V-twin engine could be a beacon of hope. For every person trapped in a silent storm, there are those willing to ride into it. You just have to find the courage to signal for help. Share this story if you believe in the power of unlikely heroes, and comment below with your own stories of when help arrived from the most unexpected of places. Support your local survivor advocacy groups. No one should have to face the storm alone.